D&D 4th edition is hated by 90% of D&D players, but I think it gets a way worse rap than it deserves, and I'm going to explain why. My name is Jay. I'm a pro game master who's run games for some pretty recognizable faces, and here at NorseFoundry, we've been exploring past editions of D&D by taking stances which have received mostly good, but some interesting responses. Yeesh. But before we can jump into the whys, we have to look at the whats. We'll dive into what 4E did well, recognize its flaws, and then I'll explain why I think it gets way more hate than it deserves. So, what did it do well? The 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons was announced by Wizards of the Coast at Gen Con in 2007, after 2 years in development, to be released the following summer. The big message they were sending was that they were taking D&D back to its roots, and everyone cheered. But what did that mean exactly? Taking a lot of influence from games like World of Warcraft, thinking they had to get ahead of where they thought the player base was trending towards, they meant returning the focus of the game to tactical combat. For combat lovers, this game was awesome, producing stunning cinematic, highly tactical gameplay. A huge focus shifted directly to the use of physical maps and miniatures in order to plot out your combat turns and make use of terrain. But this also carried over to the other side of the DM screen by mostly fixing the challenge rating system for monsters, streamlining stat blocks, and introducing monster rolls. Monster rolls were categories that were given to monsters to know how and when to use them, what purposes they served, like artillery, brutes, and soldiers, or how they were meant to be used, like solo monsters, leaders, or one-hit minions to swarm your players with. But what if we also added boss phases like RPG video games? Well, here's the bloodied condition. An enemy was considered bloodied when it typically fell below half of its hit points. This condition would allow special abilities to be used against the players, or abilities for the player to use against a bloodied enemy. Narratively, this makes so much sense as a DM to announce that the enemy is bloodied rather than trying to hint at how hurt they are when the players ask. This added to that epic battle feel and warms the Final Fantasy fan inside me, tugging on those video game RPG mechanics when you know that they're nearing the end. But how does this influence of MMORPGs affect the player characters? The answer to that is in balance. Balanced class roles that have mostly predetermined roles within the party. So much so that there are around 25 classes in total, but each of them had their own role, just like the monster roles that I mentioned earlier. Each class had distinct roles in battle, which made assembling parties far more tactical. But every party still needs a cleric, right? Who's that gonna be? Well, maybe no one! Look, 4E clerics are dope, but they're not required for healing, and that's where healing surges come in. Healing surges allow any character to spend hit dice to recover hit points during combat. This is an optional rule, but it's easily implemented by the DM if no player really wants to pick the designated healer role, which is great to have a rule built into that to help with that situation. But if you weren't going to be a cleric, maybe you could be one of the most revered aspects of 4th edition, the Warlord. The Warlord took the leader role, able to offer battlefield control by repositioning party members and giving tactical advantages. They had a martial focus, but could be built into a bunch of different playstyles like tanking, ranged, support, and hybrids of them. But combat isn't all 4th edition is known for. 4th edition also delivered challenges outside of combat that were perfect for team-based high-stakes moments, such as a chase scene, a tense social interaction, or navigating dangerous terrain. Skill challenges were such a great addition and so simple to implement. Tables were available for how many successes were needed for a particular skill check before they reached 3 failures. And there's also a table for the player level and the corresponding difficulty. So by looking up 2 tables, the DM can arrange a multitude of quick challenges to resolve any situation the party finds himself in. Genius! But that being said, I suppose there were some missteps taken by Wizards in the design of 4th edition, so let's look at the flaws. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I have a lot of issues with how this was rolled out, but my main gripe is with the lore. D&D lore has remained basically unchanged since its inception. Sure, there have been other worlds than Greyhawk with their own histories, deities, and such, but when Wizards dropped 4th edition, they made some pretty heavy changes. Certain sections of the Faerun map were just destroyed. Deities were either wiped out or narratively completely changed. It was a lot to take in. And the time jump that occurred from 3rd to 4th edition also made porting campaigns almost impossible. They also left out any kind of material allowing an easy way to make current campaigns backwards compatible. No pamphlet, excerpt, or anything, just deal with it. This was especially true when it came to the player characters and how they would convert. Short answer, they didn't. The massive shift to emulating things like World of Warcraft left the feat-based character builds of 3rd edition in the dust. It was such a hard turn that you either had to rebuild characters from scratch or just don't play 4E. Wizards of the Coast didn't want to repeat the mistakes of TSR by spreading themselves too thin. This led them to watching the market of gaming moving towards these MMOs and decided that D&D needed to evolve or die. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Or if it was going to be, it wasn't yet and didn't need to change in the way that Wizards took it. The extreme lean into heavy combat focus left many players who favored the role-playing aspects of Dungeons & Dragons behind. Yes, RP still existed, but the amount of time spent in combat by design really made it feel like an add-on between battles. Combat was to be the main focus of 4th edition whether you liked it or not. Originally designed to be around 5 rounds, but as the later books came out, they adjusted this to 10 rounds of combat. That's a long time. Wizards inadvertently removed the magic of tabletop role-playing games in order to try and keep up with a market that they had essentially invented themselves. D&D players wanted D&D, and this led to massive backlash. Even the cooler points of combat, like the bloodied condition, made metagaming even easier, allowing the players to understand the enemy was at least halfway down on its hit points. This can massively alter the course of combat, especially in a game where you're meant to be playing the part of your very mortal character. If things look rough for your character, you're always better off surviving to fight another day, unless you basically have a hit point bar floating above the enemy's head. And like I said before, this massively combat-focused game almost required the use of maps and miniatures. Powers giving measurements of squares instead of distance were aimed at players purchasing more accessories in order to play their favorite game. Theater of the Mind was being phased out, and this was met with understandable resistance.
You can't tell me how to play my make-believe.
But if you weren't sold on physical maps, terrain, and miniatures, a promise was on the horizon of an electronic solution. A video game, you say? Well, almost. A virtual tabletop system with a bunch of digital tools to aid DMs and players alike. Wait, what happened? They never arrived? Yeah. Sound familiar? For those who stayed current through the beginning of 2023, it should. But I think the final nail in the coffin came from the sheer amount of books released.
What do you mean, Jay? Wizards has always released tons of books.
Well, Wizards released the regular 3 core rule books, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Great! Except that it didn't contain the full amount of base species and classes. We had to wait for the PHB, DMG, and Monster Manual 2. And then the PHB, DMG, and Monster Manual 3. Thankfully, by the 3rd versions of the core books, most bugs had been worked out. Huzzah! But the bad side of this was the 3rd versions, known as 4E Essentials, weren't released until 2010, a full 2 years after the original release. Why? Why, after all this, do I think the Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition gets way more hate than it deserves? Well, I'll tell you. In essence, 4E was a great game. Like, no joke. I think they were genuinely onto something. The problem was the target audience. No, I don't mean you were the problem before the comments are filled with more J-hate. I mean the game was marketed to the wrong audience. The main issue of focusing on turning D&D into an MMORPG or becoming as close to it as possible meant that they missed the magic that is Dungeons & Dragons. If D&D players wanted a video game, they'd play a video game. But that's separate from what they get from playing D&D with their friends around a table. All that to say, the Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition was an incredibly daring step out into the unknown, linking the good parts of video games with D&D, and could have been an amazing TTRPG. But even though it had the D&D intellectual property, it just wasn't Dungeons & Dragons. But if you really want to understand how massive the shift was into 4th edition, I think you should click on this video here, where we dive into the development of D&D 3rd edition and 3.5.